The gymnasium on the second floor of the Chinatown Yimca in Los Angeles had 37 wooden folding chairs arranged in 3 uneven rows against the north wall, and on the evening of March the 9th, 1967, every one of them was occupied. The men sitting in those chairs were not ordinary men. They held black belts, instructor certificates, lineage papers from schools in Okinawa and Seoul and Taipei. Several of them had competed nationally. 2 had competed internationally. 1 had published a book. They were the kind of men who understood, in the precise and technical way that only practitioners understand, exactly what they were looking at when they watched another man move. And yet not one of them was looking at the right person. The man they were watching was 24 years old. His name was Derek Halloran, and he stood 6 feet and 2 inches tall and weighed 191 pounds without a gram of it that was not useful. He had been training in Tang Soo Do for 9 years and in wrestling for 4 years before that, which meant his body understood leverage the way a carpenter's hands understand wood. Not as a concept, but as a physical fact lived inside the tissue and the bone. He had won 7 consecutive regional tournaments in the California circuit. He had not been thrown, swept, or taken down in competition in 3 years and 4 months. His instructor, a former Korean military trainer named Master Park, who said very little and meant everything he said, had told him 6 months earlier that he was ready for the next level. Derek Halloran had been walking toward that next level ever since, with the particular kind of confidence that comes not from arrogance but from accumulated evidence. He was demonstrating a combination that evening, a low kick that dissolved into a high kick that dissolved into a hand strike. The sequence was clean. It was precise, it was genuinely impressive, and the men in the folding chairs knew it, and the quality of their attention said so. Nobody was watching the man in the 4th row. He was sitting at the far left end of the row, near the wall. He had arrived 20 minutes before the demonstration began and had taken that seat without speaking to anyone. He was wearing dark trousers and a plain gray jacket, and he had a notepad balanced on one knee that he had not written anything in. He looked like someone who had wandered in from another appointment. He looked like a man who might be waiting for a bus. He was 5 feet and 7 inches tall. He could not have weighed more than 135 pounds. There was nothing about him from the outside that would have drawn your eye if anything else in the room was moving. His name was Bruce Lee. He was 26 years old. He had been training since the age of 13. He had studied Wing Chun under Ip Man in Hong Kong. He had studied boxing, fencing, wrestling, judo, and the footwork patterns of Muhammad Ali, whom he had watched on film so many times and at such close range that he could describe from memory the angle of Ali's left shoulder in 40 separate photographs. He had developed in the years since arriving in the United States a method of fighting that did not yet have a widely used name, a way of moving that did not belong to any single tradition but had been assembled from every tradition that worked, stripped of everything that did not. He had been testing and revising this method for years in private. Most of the men in this room had heard his name. Most of them had formed an opinion of him based on what they had heard. None of them had felt his hands. In 14 minutes, one man in this room would, and what that man would say afterward, the specific sentence he would produce while still sitting on the gymnasium floor, spoken quietly and without performance, to no audience but the bare ceiling above him, would be repeated in martial arts schools for the next 5 decades. If you want to hear that sentence, stay until the end. Derek Halloran finished his combination, and the men in the folding chairs gave him the measured, expert applause of people who know what they have seen and are not easily moved to excess. He bowed to the room. He straightened. He was breathing evenly, which was itself a kind of statement. It was at that moment that he noticed the man sitting at the left end of the 4th row. He noticed him because most of the men in the room were leaning forward with their elbows on their knees, the posture of people who have just seen something and are still processing it. And this one man was sitting completely upright with his hands resting open on his thighs and his eyes level and still. It was a quality of stillness that was, when you finally noticed it, more noticeable than movement would have been. Halloran looked at him for a moment. He looked around the room at the other faces, which were familiar to him in the way that faces become familiar inside a circuit, where you see the same people at enough events that you know their records if not their names. He looked back at the still man in the gray jacket. One of Halloran's training partners, a man named Collins who had driven with him from the valley. leaned close and said something. Halloran listened. Whatever Collins said produced a small shift in Halloran's expression that was not quite a smile and not quite dismissal but occupied the territory between them. Halloran said something back to Collins. Then he took 3 steps toward the 4th row and stopped. He stood there for a moment with his weight easy and his hands at his sides. When he spoke, his voice was calibrated for the room, not just for the man in front of him. He said that he had heard a great deal about Wing Chun. He said that he respected the tradition. He said that he was always interested in understanding what a system could actually do when pressure was applied to it. He said these things in a tone that was reasonable and measured and, underneath the reasonableness and the measure, the precise equivalent of a hand extended palm out, not to offer a handshake but to prevent passage. Then he said he would be glad to learn something tonight, if the gentleman from Hong Kong would care to show him something worth learning. The gymnasium became a particular kind of quiet. It was not the quiet of an empty room. It was the quiet of a room in which 37 people with trained bodies and calibrated minds had all simultaneously understood what had just been said and were now completely still, the way a field of tall grass goes still in the 2 seconds before the wind shifts. The man in the gray jacket did not move immediately. He sat for a moment longer in the same posture, with his hands open on his thighs. Then he reached down and picked up the notepad from his knee and set it carefully on the empty chair beside him. He straightened the edge of it against the edge of the chair. He stood up. He removed the gray jacket. He folded it once across the middle with the sleeves aligned and set it on top of the notepad. He stood in a plain white t-shirt. He rolled neither his shoulders nor his neck. He did not close and open his hands. He did not shift his weight or settle into any recognizable fighting stance. He simply stood there in plain clothes with his arms at his sides, looking at Derek Halloran the way a man looks at a doorway before deciding whether to walk through it. From the 2nd row, a tournament director named Gerald Malone, who had been organizing California martial arts competitions for 11 years and had watched several thousand sparring exchanges in that time, later said that what he felt in that moment was not anticipation and not tension, but something closer to the sensation of standing at a great height. The kind of feeling, he said, that your body produces before your mind is caught up to what your body already knows. From the 3rd row, a judo instructor named Raymond Cho, who had competed at the national level and whose opinion was not given lightly, would recall afterward that he set his coffee cup down in that moment. He had been holding it for several minutes. He set it down on the floor beside his chair with both hands, and he did not pick it up again. From the aisle, a young man named Thomas Webb, who was assisting with the equipment that evening, had stopped moving entirely. He would later describe having the sensation that the air in the room had changed pressure. Nobody knew what they were about to watch. They thought they did. That was the particular texture of this moment. 37 men with genuine knowledge and real expertise, all of them certain they understood the parameters of what was about to happen, none of them close. If you have been watching this channel for any time at all, you already understand something that the men in that gymnasium did not. The man who had just stood up had already won. The man he was about to face simply did not know it yet. Before we go any further, if you want to hear every second of what happened next, and if you want to understand the specific thing that Bruce Lee said to Derek Halloran on the gymnasium floor that nobody outside that room heard for 15 years, make sure you are subscribed right now and drop a comment below telling us where in the world you are watching this from. This story does not end where you think it ends. To understand why what happened in the next 47 seconds matters, you first have to understand where each of these men was standing. Derek Halloran was standing exactly where he had spent 9 years building the right to stand. He had entered the martial arts in 1958, at the age of 15, through the gymnasium of a Tang Soo Do instructor named Sergeant First Class William Hyun, who had brought the system home from Korea after his 2nd tour. Hyun's approach to teaching was not gentle. His approach to teaching was the approach of a man who had seen what bodies do to other bodies under real pressure and had decided that the only honest preparation was to make the training as close to that reality as a controlled environment permitted. Halloran had stayed. Most of the other boys who started that year had not. He had stayed through the first year, which was almost entirely falling and rising and falling again. He had stayed through the 2nd year, in which Hyun began to let him spar, and the sparring revealed that Halloran had a natural aptitude for reading distance. an ability to feel the edge of his own range and the edge of his opponent's range as a kind of spatial language that most people have to learn consciously, and that he seemed to have arrived with. He had stayed through the years of competition, the regional circuit, the tournaments in Sacramento and San Diego and Phoenix, the record that had accumulated win by win until it was a record that preceded him into any room he entered. He had stayed through the conversation with Master Park, who had looked at him for a long time before saying what he said. Park was a man who gave credit the way a bank gives credit after careful evaluation in precise amounts with no excess. What Park had said was that Halloran's technique was legitimate and that his instincts were real, and that the only thing separating him from the next level was experience of a kind that competition could not fully provide. The kind of experience, Park had said, that only comes from standing in front of someone whose system is genuinely different from yours and finding out what your system does when it meets something it has not prepared for. Halloran had been looking for that experience for 6 months. He believed, standing in the gymnasium of the Chinatown Yimka, that he had found it. He was correct, though not in the way he meant. The man standing 12 feet away from him on the gymnasium floor had been on a different road, one that had begun in a different country under a different sky, and had led through a sequence of experiences that had produced something that did not exist in any of the lineages represented in those folding chairs. Bruce Lee had started in Wing Chun because of a fight he had been in at 13 that he had not entirely won, and a practical recognition formed in the aftermath of that fight that wanting to win and knowing how to win were not the same thing. Ip Man had given him the foundation, the center line theory, the chain punching, the simultaneous block and strike concept that collapsed the distance between defense and offense into a single movement. Lee had absorbed the foundation the way certain people absorb languages, not word by word but in whole grammars, getting the underlying logic before the surface details, so that the system lived in him as a way of thinking rather than a catalog of techniques. Then he had done something that almost no one trained in a classical system does, because classical systems are built around the premise that the system is sufficient and that departure from it is a form of error. He had left, not entirely and not all at once, but he had begun to ask what the system could not do and to look elsewhere for what was missing. He had looked at Western boxing and found the footwork. He had looked at fencing and found the longest weapon, closest target principle that would become one of the organizing ideas of everything he developed afterward. He had looked at wrestling and found the body mechanics of takedowns and understood why a striking art that ignored them was incomplete. He had looked at film of Ali and found something that no instructor had ever explicitly taught him, which was that the most important thing in a fight is not what you throw but where you are when you throw it, and that the question of where you are is answered before the fight begins by how you have trained yourself to move. He had been building for 5 years a personal fighting system that had no name yet, one that was drawn from everything that worked and constrained by nothing that did not. He had been testing it in controlled conditions and some that were less controlled. He had been revising it fight by fight and hour by hour in his garage in Culver City, where he trained alone in the morning before his students arrived, working on things that had no name yet in front of a mirror that took up the entire north wall. The 37 men in the folding chairs were martial artists, real ones. They understood fighting in the technical, practiced, deeply informed way. Not one of them had any framework for what they were about to see. The distance between Bruce Lee and Derek Halloran was 12 feet. Halloran reduced it to 9. He did not rush. He moved the way a man moves when he is technically confident and professionally calm, with weight that settled rather than arrived, covering the 3 feet in 2 unhurried steps and stopping. His hands were not raised in a formal guard but were loose and slightly forward. The posture of a man who has sparred enough that he does not need theater. Lee did not move. He stood exactly where he had been standing when he set his jacket down. His feet were under his shoulders. His hands were at his sides. He was looking at Halloran in the particular way that people who have trained deeply look at an opponent, not at the face, not at the hands, but at the whole person at once, the kind of wide-angle attention that receives everything and focuses on nothing. Halloran looked at the hands at the sides. He had been trained to read guards. He understood, in the way his body understood things that his mind had internalized through repetition, what a high guard meant and what a low guard meant and what a side guard meant. He understood the weight distributions that different stances implied and the openings that each weight distribution created. There was no guard. This was information. Halloran processed it. A man with no guard is either a beginner who does not know he should have one, or something else. The man standing in front of him was not a beginner. That left the other category, which Halloran's training had not given him a precise name for. He decided to gather more information. He extended a jab. It was not a committed jab, it was a measuring jab, the kind thrown to establish range and to read the response. The kind that contains only enough of your body that you can recover it if what comes back is not what you expected. What came back was not what he expected. He did not expect nothing. Lee had moved. That was incontestable, because the jab had passed through air that Lee had been occupying a fraction of a second before, and Lee was now standing in a slightly different position to the outside of Halloran's lead shoulder. The movement had been small. It had not been a jump or a dive or any dramatic evasion. It had been closer to what happens when you try to step on a shadow. The shadow is not there, and the thing casting it is somewhere else. In the third row, Gerald Malone's hands, which had been loose on his knees, went flat. In the second row, Raymond Cho tilted his head approximately 4 degrees to the right. Thomas Webb, from the aisle, stopped breathing. Halloran reset. He processed what had happened in the compressed and rapid way that experienced fighters process mid-exchange data, not as a narrative but as geometry, where he had been, where the other man had been, where the other man now was, and what that implied about what the other man could do from there. He decided to commit more. This is a thing that fighters with strong records do. It is not wrong. It reflects a correct understanding that tentative attacks are more dangerous than committed ones, because a tentative attack gives the opponent range, data, and initiative without spending enough of your own structure to force a response. Halloran committed more. Second 7. He threw a rear cross followed immediately by a front kick. A combination that he had landed in competition many times because the cross occupied the opponent's hands and the kick came through the space the hands had vacated. It was a real combination. It was the kind of combination that works against trained opponents. It arrived in empty air. Lee was no longer in the place the combination was going. He was to the right and slightly closer than he had been, which was the opposite of what should have been possible given the geometry of the exchange, and his right hand had arrived at the side of Halloran's left ear before Halloran had fully registered that the combination had missed. The hand did not hit. It stopped. It was held approximately 2 inches from the side of Halloran's head. Fingers open, heel of the palm forward, the room registered this in silence. A fight is not, in its deepest form, a collision of techniques. This is the misunderstanding that produces fighters who know many techniques and cannot fight. A fight is a problem of geometry. It is the question of where you are in relation to another person and how that relationship changes over time. The person who controls the geometry controls the fight. The person who controls the geometry does not need to be stronger or larger or faster in the raw physical sense. They need only to be in the right place at the right moment, consistently, which is a skill that looks like magic to people watching it and feels like reading to the person executing it. Not fast reading, just reading. With full comprehension. The distance between two people in a fight is not a number, it is a condition. It changes faster than the mind can track it consciously, which is why the mind cannot be in charge of it. The body has to understand it the way the body understands balance, not through calculation but through a state of continuous readiness that does not require thought, only attention. Bruce Lee had been building this understanding for 13 years. Derek Halloran understood this, somewhere beneath language in the half-second that passed between the hand stopping 2 inches from his head and what came next. What came next was second 22. Halloran stepped back. It was not a retreat in any dishonorable sense. It was the intelligent response to information. He had gathered enough information to understand that his model of what was happening was wrong and that he needed space to build a new one. Lee let the space open. This also was information. A fighter who presses when the opponent creates space is a fighter who values control of distance. Lee did not press. He remained where he was, hands back at his sides, and watched Halloran reset from 7 feet away. Halloran reset. He had now been in this exchange for approximately 20 seconds and had thrown 3 attacks and made no contact and absorbed 1 not quite strike that had stopped before delivery. He was not hurt. He was not winded. He was recalibrating in the profound way that real fighters recalibrate when the map they came in with does not match the territory in front of them. In the third row, Gerald Malone had not moved. In the second row, Raymond Cho had placed both hands flat on his own knees, which he did not realize until afterward. Thomas Webb had sat down on the equipment case he had been standing next to. He did this without looking at it. He sat down because his legs had decided to sit down without his instruction. Halloran looked at the man in the plain white t-shirt standing 7 feet away with his hands at his sides. He understood something now that he had not understood 30 seconds ago. He set his feet. He chose his technique. He chose it carefully, selecting from his full catalog the attack that his experience told him was his most reliable, the one he had landed most consistently against opponents who were technically capable, the one that had produced results in the circumstances most similar to what he was currently facing. He threw it. Second 31. It was a spinning back kick. It was his best technique. It was legitimately his best technique. Not a technique he was still learning, not one he threw because it looked impressive, but one he had thrown so many thousands of times that it lived in his body as a native language. The rotation was clean, the chamber was correct. The extension began at the precise moment the weight transfer completed. It arrived in air. Lee had moved again. He had moved differently this time, not to the outside but straight back, a distance of approximately 18 inches, enough and only enough to create the specific margin of clearance that the kick required, no more than that, and his right hand had come forward as the kick passed and made contact with Halloran's right shoulder blade at the moment of maximum extension. A touch that applied no force beyond confirmation. Halloran landed. He had not been thrown, he had not been struck with any force. The kick had passed through empty space, and he had landed from it in the ordinary way that a spinning kick lands when it makes no contact, on his feet, with his back to his opponent, needing to rotate to re-establish. He rotated. Lee was standing exactly 4 feet away, hands at his sides, waiting. Halloran looked at him. This was second 37. The room was producing no sound. This is unusual. Rooms with 37 people in them produce a continuous background of small sounds, breathing, shifting weight, fabric against chair. That only becomes noticeable when it stops. It had stopped. 37 trained martial artists were sitting in 3 rows of folding chairs without producing a sound that the room could measure. Halloran breathed. He understood several things now. He understood that his timing model was wrong, not slightly calibrated wrong, but structurally wrong, built around an assumption about reaction time that did not apply to the man in front of him. He understood that his distance model was wrong in the same structural way. He understood that the 3 techniques he had thrown had not been countered in the sense that a block counters a strike or a parry counters a thrust, but had simply not found the person they were aimed at, because that person had not been where Halloran's model said he would be. He understood that he was standing in front of something he had not previously encountered. He stood for a moment with this understanding. He stood the way a man stands when he has walked into a room expecting to find familiar furniture and found instead that the walls are in the wrong places. Then he moved forward. Second 41. He moved forward with a commitment that was not recklessness but honesty. He had exhausted the strategic options available from distance. The geometry at 7 feet was not working. He closed to 3 feet and threw with his hands a rapid combination of the kind that his training had built into reflex. Left, right, left. The kind of combination that does not need to be aimed so much as delivered. Because at 3 feet the space is small enough that the delivery itself creates the problem for the opponent. He felt contact. Real contact. His lead hand on a forearm, a genuine touch. The first in 41 seconds. He did not feel what came from the other direction until it was already finished. Lee's left hand had come inside the combination at the second beat. A deflection so small it qualified more as a redirection than a block, barely changing the vector of the right cross by 2 or 3 inches, enough to send it past instead of through, and his right hand had followed immediately, not the palm forward touch of the earlier exchange, but a proper strike, 4 fingers extended and close together, aimed at the solar plexus. Stopped with the fingertips making contact at approximately 1/4 of the force that the strike contained. 1/4 of the force was enough, not to injure, not to damage, but to convey, with an exactness that could not have been achieved with words, what the other 3/4 felt like. Halloran sat down, not fell, not collapsed. Sat, the way a man sits when his legs have received a message from his midsection that they have decided to honor. He was seated on the gymnasium floor with both hands slightly forward and his weight organized and his breathing interrupted, and he was looking up at the ceiling of the gymnasium, which was pale yellow and had water stains in one corner. And he remained there for what witnesses later estimated at between 4 and 7 seconds before he was capable of drawing a full breath. Lee stood above him. He had not stepped back. He was standing 2 feet from where Halloran sat, and his right hand was extended downward, not in any formal way, just a hand offered to a man on the floor. Halloran looked at the hand. He looked at it for a moment that was longer than it needed to be, but shorter than it could have been. Then he reached up and took it, and Lee helped him to his feet, not with effort, just with the stable weight of a man who knows how to stand. They were face to face at a distance of approximately 18 inches. Lee said something. He said it quietly, in a register that did not carry beyond the 2 feet of space between them, and what he said had nothing in it of performance or instruction or the particular weight that men put into words when they know the words are being heard by an audience. It was said as a simple thing, from one person to another person. In the way that true things are said when there is no reason to dress them. Halloran heard it. He stood with it for a moment. Then he nodded. Once, Lee picked up his jacket from the chair in the 4th row. He put it on. He picked up the notepad. He walked to the exit at the west end of the gymnasium without speaking to anyone else. And the room adjusted to his passing the way a body of water adjusts to a stone dropped in it. A ripple outward in all directions, a return to surface, and a surface that is, when you look at it closely, not quite the same as it was before. At the door, a young man named Arthur Lim, who had been sitting in the 1st row and was 20 years old and had been training for 3 years and who would go on to teach martial arts for the next 4 decades in Pasadena, reached out as Lee passed and briefly touched his shoulder. Not to stop him, not to say anything. The way you touch something to confirm it is real. Lee continued through the door. The door closed. The gymnasium held its silence for another moment, the way a room holds a sound after it has stopped. Then Gerald Malone said, "Did anyone else just see that?" He did not say it as a question. What happened in that gymnasium on the 9th of March 1967 did not stay in that gymnasium. This is what stories do. A story with this specific gravity, witnessed by this many people with this much expertise, set in a room with this much already at stake, does not stay in the building where it happened. It moves outward through the people who were there, along the exact channels that those people inhabit. The schools where they teach, the tournaments where they judge, the training sessions where they are the senior person in the room and the junior people listen to what they say. It moved outward slowly at first. The way any story moves in the years before transmission is instant. Gerald Malone told it at a tournament in Pasadena 7 weeks later. Raymond Cho told it to a student at his judo school in Glendale, who told it to his brother-in-law who had no martial arts background at all, but who understood the shape of it well enough to tell it at a dinner table in Burbank, where it lost most of its technical detail and retained only the essential geometry. A man sat down on a floor and looked at a ceiling and understood something true. Derek Halloran told no one. Not immediately. Not for years. He was a private man in the particular way that people who have built a reputation through discipline tend to be private, guarded about the gap between what they have said they are and what a given moment has revealed. He had not done anything shameful in that gymnasium. He had stood in front of someone genuinely exceptional, and had responded with honesty and had not quit and had, in the end, taken the hand. There was nothing in any of that to be ashamed of. But it had reorganized something in him that he needed time to understand before he could speak about it. The time he needed was approximately 3 years. In 1970, Halloran told the story to a group of his own students. He told it not as a defeat, but as an education. He told it as the specific kind of education that only comes from the particular experience Master Park had pointed him toward, standing in front of something your system has not prepared for and finding out what you do. What he had done, he told them, was what every honest martial artist does when they encounter something real. He had paid attention. He had kept moving. He had not pretended. Arthur Lim, the young man from the first row who had touched Lee's shoulder at the door, became a teacher, as has been mentioned, and taught in Pasadena for 40 years. He told the story of March the 9th every year to the students entering his school for the first time, not in the first class but in the third, after he had had time to understand what each new student thought they were there to learn. He told it as a story about perception. He told it as a story about the difference between a credential and a capacity. He told it as a story about the specific price of certainty, which is not failure. Failure, he always said, is just data, but the moment before the fall, when you are certain and wrong, and the world is about to have a conversation with you that you did not schedule. The story moved through dojos and tournament circuits and school corridors for the rest of the decade. And through the decades after, and as it moved, it collected the usual barnacles that stories collect in transit, small additions, substituted details, a crowd that grew from 37 to 200 and then to 400, and then back to somewhere in the middle, a date that migrated between years, an attributed quote that some versions included and others did not. The question of which technique had ended the exchange growing more dramatic in some tellings and more technical in others. What did not change in any version of the story told by anyone who had been in the room was this: the man in the gray jacket had stood up and folded his jacket once, and the outcome had not been in doubt from that moment, though everyone in the room had believed it was. Thomas Webb, who had sat down on the equipment case without looking at it, went on to become a stunt coordinator in the film industry, which was, if you thought about it, an almost inevitable destination for a young man whose defining professional experience was watching something happen that he did not have adequate language for. He worked in the film industry for 31 years. He was asked about that evening in the gymnasium on at least a dozen occasions by people in that industry who had heard the story in one form or another, and his answer was always the same. He said, "It was the first time I understood that there is a category of human capability that exists entirely outside the range of what you previously believed was possible, and that the experience of encountering it does not teach you that category immediately. It teaches you first that the category exists. Understanding what is in it takes the rest of your life." As for what Bruce Lee said to Derek Halloran from 2 feet away, while Halloran was still organizing his breathing and his understanding simultaneously, Halloran was asked about it twice in public. Once in a 1973 interview in a regional martial arts magazine, and once at a seminar in 1981. Both times he answered the same way. He said that what Lee said was not a lesson, and not a consolation, and not any of the things you might expect a man to say to another man he had just put on the floor. He said it was closer to something you say when you have been watching someone carefully for several minutes, and you have understood something about them that they do not yet know about themselves. What Lee said was, "You are going to be very good at this. Not someday, and not if you do certain things, and not in the qualified way that instructors hedge their predictions to protect themselves from being wrong. Just, you are going to be very good at this." Halloran sat with that sentence in the gymnasium for 7 seconds, and has been sitting with it for the rest of his life. Though sitting is perhaps not the right word for what a man does with something that becomes one of the organizing facts of his own story. He has been building with it, more accurately, the way a craftsman builds with a piece of material that arrived from outside his plans and turned out to be load-bearing. He did become very good at this. That is not a footnote. That is part of the story. What happened in that gymnasium on March the 9th, 1967, was not simply that a man with an exceptional ability walked into a room and demonstrated it and walked back out. That happens. Exceptional abilities are demonstrated in rooms all the time, and the rooms absorb the demonstrations and go back to being rooms. What happened was more structural than that. What happened was that 37 men who had built their understanding of what was possible inside a set of assumptions went home that evening and discovered that the assumptions had a boundary they had not known about, and that the boundary was not the edge of what was possible, but only the edge of what they had encountered. The assumptions had not been wrong. They had been insufficient. And insufficient is a different kind of problem from wrong. Because wrong you can correct directly, but insufficient requires you to go looking for what is missing, which means first admitting that something is missing, which is the part that takes the longest. The thing that makes a man worth watching is not his technique. Technique can be learned by anyone with sufficient time and sufficient willingness to be uncomfortable. The thing that makes a man worth watching is whether, when he discovers that his model of the world does not match the world, he revises the model. Most people do not. Most people look for the error in the world. It is easier, and it is human, and it is wrong. Derek Halloran revised the model. It took him time, but he revised it. He trained differently afterward. He sought out people whose systems were different from his. He became, as the man in the gray jacket had said he would, very good at this. And he became, which is rarer and perhaps more important, the kind of teacher who teaches the thing that cannot be drilled, that what you do not know is not a deficit in your character. It is an invitation. Certainty is the one technique that fails at the highest level. Every other technique can be refined and improved and combined with other techniques until it approaches something reliable. Certainty cannot be refined. It can only be laid down. The man who knows he might be wrong moves better than the man who knows he is right. He moves better because he is actually paying attention to what is happening, rather than to his prediction of what is happening. And the difference between what is happening and your prediction of what is happening is, in the time it takes a hand to travel 2 feet, the entire difference between where you are and where you thought you were. The gymnasium in the Chinatown Yimka is not there anymore in the form it took on March the 9th, 1967. Buildings are renovated. Buildings are repurposed. The folding chairs are somewhere else or not anywhere, and the pale yellow ceiling with the water stains in one corner is under layers of different decisions made by different people for different reasons. But the 37 men who were in the room, and the students they taught, and the students those students taught, and the story that moved outward along all of those lines at once, those are still moving. The story is still in transit. It has been in transit for nearly 60 years, gaining details in some versions and losing them in others, the crowd growing and shrinking and growing again, the date migrating, the words of the private sentence changing in some accounts and holding in others. What holds in all of them is the jacket, folded once on the chair. What holds is the man sitting on the floor looking at a ceiling and breathing. What holds is the hand, extended without performance, from above. What holds is a sentence said quietly to one person in a room full of people, in a register that did not carry about what that person would become. That is what holds. Because that is the part that was true. Next time, we go to a film set in 1973, where a stunt coordinator with 15 years of professional experience and a reputation that preceded him into every production he worked on walked into Bruce Lee's final film and said something on the first morning that he would spend the rest of his career wishing he had not said. We will tell you what he said, and we will tell you what happened in the 17 seconds that followed. And we will tell you what Bruce Lee did afterward that no one who was on that set has ever fully explained. That story begins next week.